Well, we have reached day 3 of our Leasehold Made Simple week, which is powered by our friends and colleagues at Anthony Gold Solicitors, who have experts in this area of law. And I'm delighted to be joined today by Lauren McKie, who is Leasehold Executive within the department here at Anthony Gold. And today, Lauren, we're going to talk about extending a lease. And this is something that obviously landlords need to be aware of. And what are the instances where a lease would need to be extended?
So generally the biggest thing is when your lease sort of drops, sort of mainly below 80 years. That's sort of like the key point, because the more the lease reduces in length, the more the value of the property is going to go down.
Indeed, and also from the lending perspective as well, lenders tend to not want to lend on leases less than 80 years.
Yeah, that's correct. It's going to be harder for someone that's looking to sell or remortgage their property if their lease is below 80 years.
So I think it's very important that if you've got some landlord software that you actually put when your lease, how long you've got left on your lease, and just be aware of that, because particularly with people with big portfolios, they can lose track, and if it drops below 80 years, then that can be an issue. So when people realise that they have a lease that needs extending, with the government reform that's currently ongoing, it's very hard to know whether you should wait to see if, things improve or conditions improve, or whether you should go ahead with the lease extension now. Now, does Anthony Gold have a view on that?
Yeah, so I think our view is that there's no point in waiting. You may as well just extend now, because what's happening with the government's changes, we don't know exactly what the changes are going to be. Mm-hmm. We don't know how long it's going to take until they take effect. And the longer that you're waiting to extend your lease, the more the premium's going to go up, the more expensive it's going to be for you.
So, I guess, we can only work with what we know to be the case today, not what might come in. I think some of the time frames given for leasehold reform are kind of 3 to 5 years. So you can only really go with what's today. So when a landlord or leaseholder realises that they need to extend their lease, what is the process?
Sure, so there's 2 options really for extending your lease. There's the informal route, which is where you would just approach your freeholder, see if you can kind of negotiate a deal with them. It would obviously be best to instruct a solicitor for this in order to get you the best deal. Quite often the freeholders can be a bit difficult, or perhaps they're not entirely sure of the process, and so they'd prefer to sort of go down the statutory route, which is where you would serve a notice on your freeholder, and that would then entitle you to an additional 90 years and removal of the ground rent. Again, it's always best to instruct a solicitor to draft and serve that notice, because there's a prescribed form under the Act that you have to follow, and if you get it wrong, the freeholder could say that it's invalid, and then you'd have to wait a whole year before you can then serve again, which is obviously going to, increase the premium.
And does the freeholder have to extend your lease? Do they have a say on that?
Yeah, so definitely under the Act, you have an entitlement, as long as you can show that you've had ownership of that property at Land Registry for the last 2 years. You are entitled under the Act to an additional 90 years and removal of the ground rent. So a freeholder isn't allowed to say no. Obviously, we do have situations where the freeholder is still not willing to grant a lease extension, or sometimes they're even missing absent landlords that we can't sort of get hold of. So in that case, you would look at issuing county court proceedings, where a judge would then be able to sign off any lease extension deed for you.
Okay, well that's interesting, because that is a problem that does crop up quite a lot, that there's an absent freeholder, and it's quite tricky to know what to do in that situation. So there is a remedy for that.
Yeah, there's definitely a remedy where you can. Obviously, again, it's always best to instruct a solicitor to issue those proceedings on your behalf, and take it forward.
Fantastic. And I think one thing that, does concern landlords about extending leases, some see it as an actual opportunity, to buy a property with the short lease and extend it, and thereby improve the value of the property through extending the length of the lease. But, it can be actually a very costly procedure, can't it?
Yeah, it can. So it kind of, how it works is, generally, the lower your lease is, the more expensive the more higher the premium's going to be. So yeah, the more expensive it will be. You can actually instruct a surveyor who sort of has expertise in lease extensions, who will be able to give you a more accurate valuation.
So Lauren, you mentioned that there were two routes that a leaseholder could go down to extend their lease. How do they go about deciding which is the best route for them?
Yeah, normally we sort of say that in the first instance they should try and approach their freeholder informally, just to see whether they'd be willing to sort of cut a deal. And then if they are perhaps being a bit difficult, then they could always switch to serving a notice under the statutory route. We also will always ask who the landlord is, because we kind of know with certain landlords, especially like council landlords, they sort of prefer to have a notice served on them. So in that case, we would advise the client to just go ahead and serve the notice straight away.
And if they do choose to work with a solicitor such as Anthony Gold, can you help with the negotiation process and maybe get them a better deal?
Yeah, we definitely can. We can sort of give them some advice on what the likely premium will be just by looking at the current length of the lease, what their ground rent is, and also how much the property is worth. We also work with a lot of surveyors that sort of specialise in doing lease extension valuations that we can sort of put them in touch with.
Yeah, because that's an important point, that there's actually a formula that's used to calculate what it's going to cost to extend a lease, and the lower the lease or the time left on the lease, then obviously the higher the premium.
Yeah, exactly.
So that really is kind of a strong indicator to think about your lease extension earlier rather than later.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. Okay. Well, it's a very interesting topic. Thank you for joining me. We'll see more of Lauren later in the week. But for now, that's today's instalment concluded. But please do join us tomorrow as our Leasehold Made Simple week continues.